is concluded in accordance with Standing Order 43. Questions without notice. The member for McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the global thalidomide disaster meant that babies were born with injuries, including hearing loss, shortened limbs, loss of sight and missing limbs. There are now about 130 Australian survivors, including Lisa McManus, who is today pleading with the government to respond to the parliamentary report into Australia's thalidomide tragedy before more survivors die. Why hasn't the Prime Minister responded to this report, which was handed down in March last year?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I'm actually very pleased to receive this question. It's a matter of extreme importance. No government in the last 50 years has taken it as seriously as us. Those Australians who suffered from thalidomide and all of the consequences were given a grave injustice. On my watch, in my time, on our watch, in our time, it is our goal to do what no government has previously done, and that is to ensure that there is justice, that there is an apology, that there is vindication and that there is support going forward. I note I heard an interjection from the member for Maribyrnong. This was an issue he raised before the election, but for which he did not provision at the election. This is an issue for which he did not provision at the election. Having said that, we are now working very carefully through a once-in-a-generation response to an issue which has not been dealt with previously by any Australian government in any systemic fashion over 50 years. And we will provide that response in a way that no other government has ever done. And as I said, I note that given the opportunity to make a provision for this, the opposition did not, the member for Maribyrnong as leader did not, the Shadow Minister as Shadow Treasurer did not. But we will take steps to do what no government has ever done, and we are working through that calmly and carefully and appropriately to deliver justice to those thalidomide victims who have never before been given that justice.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House why it is important to take responsible and considered decisions when it comes to economic and financial management in the face of challenging economic circumstances? And is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Sturt for his question. Mr Speaker, as I reported together with the Health Minister and the Treasurer just before question time, the coronavirus's impact is ongoing. There are many things that remain unknown in relation to the coronavirus's impact, not just on the health impacts, not just here in Australia but around the world, but of course the economic impacts being felt here domestically. And the government is continuing to monitor very closely and respond based on the best possible health advice in relation to what is a global health crisis, and we will continue to working with states and territories to ensure that we can provide the best possible responses. Australians are also dealing more generally with the response to fires, to floods and to drought as well, and the government has responded in each and all of these cases, whether it was the North Queensland floods of a year ago, of course the National Bushfire Recovery Agency and the $2 billion commitment that we've provided without putting a levy on the Australian people to provide that disaster response, and the more than $7 billion in support and commitment that we've been providing to our rural and regional communities as the drought has continued to ravage so many parts of this country. It's true to say, Mr Speaker, that the Australian people, the Australian economy has had its fair share of damaging impacts, particularly in recent times and in recent years, Mr Speaker, and we certainly don't need any more. We are not immune from these things, but, Mr Speaker, we are well prepared, and our government over the course of the last 6 years has been ensuring that as we go into these very difficult crises that we've been managing in recent times, that our sensible and disciplined economic management has been putting Australia in the best possible place to deal with these types of crises. And, Mr Speaker, when we do things in a disciplined and responsible way, we think them through, Where we have goals to create jobs, we have plans to create jobs, and we implement those plans to create jobs, Mr Speaker. When we say, and we go to the Australian people and we say we've got record funding to put in schools and hospitals and to fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we have the careful, disciplined budget management so the Australian people know we can deliver on those commitments, which we are, Mr Speaker. That's what careful, disciplined, responsible economic management is based on. Now, the Leader of the Labor Party does not embrace that approach. Sure, he's got a proposal to commit to a 2050 net zero carbon target by 2050, 30 years from now, but he can't even tell the Australian people what he'd do 10 years from now, Mr Speaker, not 30 years. But the real problem with the Leader of the Opposition's approach, he has no plan to deliver it, he can't tell the Australian people what it would cost, and he can't explain to them, Mr Speaker, what the implications will be for them. Mr Speaker, it is a rash plan. It is an ill-considered plan. It is a plan that has not been thought through, and the Australian people would pay.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last night, the Director-General of ASIO said the extreme right-wing threat in Australia is real and it's growing. And also last night, the UK government prescribed additional right-wing extremist groups. Why has the Australian government not listed a single right-wing extremist group as a terrorist organisation?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is this government that restored the funding to our intelligence agencies, our border protection authorities, that those opposite when they were in government stripped out and left Australians vulnerable on their watch. In 2013, Mr Speaker, this government came to office to keep Australians safe, and no government has invested more and applied itself more to give those who are working on counter-terrorism in this country the resources they need to go after those who would seek to do Australians harm. That includes right-wing extremists, Mr Speaker. That includes Islamic terrorists, extremists, Islamic terrorists, Mr Speaker. Whatever their cause of hate, whatever their motivation to do Australians harm, this government is standing up to them with the resources and the commitments and the legislation and the powers and the tools that those opposite never had the stomach to put in place. And on each occasion, Mr Speaker, it would seem that every time we've sought to get stronger national security legislation achieved in this place, those opposite have sought to water it down.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question goes to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please—
The member for Fairfax resume his seat. The member for Isaacs and the Minister for Home Affairs will cease their interchange. I can't hear the question. The member for Fairfax will begin his question again.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And my question goes to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please update the House on how the Morrison government is maintaining the resilience of the Australian economy in the face of some challenging economic circumstances, and also is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches which may undermine the strength of our economy?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fairfax for his question and note his extensive experience in business before coming to this place, and the fact that in his electorate more than 20,000 small businesses will be able to access the extended instant asset write-off announced in last year's budget and will get a tax cut from the 1st of July this year, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that the Australian economy has faced a number of economic shocks that are outside of our control. The trade tensions between China and the United States, the drought, the bushfires, the floods, and most recently, Mr Speaker, the coronavirus. And when I was recently at the G20 meeting in Riyadh, the impact of the coronavirus was the most significant topic for discussion. And we know that it's affecting the global economy, with the IMF saying that economic growth will be down by about 0.1 of a percentage point, Mr Speaker, in this year in 2020. And here in Australia we've seen an impact as well. seen an impact on agriculture, seen an impact on tourism, seen an impact on international students, Mr Speaker, and also seeing disruption to end-to-end supply chains across the economy. But, Mr Speaker, our economy is resilient. The economic discipline that we have undertaken over the last 6 and a bit years have put Australia in a strong place to weather these economic shocks. Unemployment today is lower than when we came to government, Mr Speaker. We've delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker, the biggest tax cuts in more than 20 years, Mr Speaker, and that is putting Australia in a stronger position as any other country to weather these economic shocks. But I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Now, Mr Speaker, there's a very innovative approach from the member for Rankin who likes to tax a lot, Mr Speaker. His very innovative approach, Mr Speaker, which when he was burnishing his leadership credentials the other day at the Australia Institute, is to deliver a well-being budget, Mr Speaker. A well-being budget. Gone are the days of measuring GDP, gone are the days of measuring unemployment, gone are the days of lower taxes and balanced budgets, Mr Speaker. What are you going to get from the member for Rankin's well-being budget, Mr Speaker? Double the hugs and triple the taxes, Mr Speaker. Double the hugs and triple the taxes, Mr Speaker. Now, when Labor hasn't delivered a balanced budget since 1989, when the Berlin Wall was still standing, of course you're going to look for something else to measure, Mr Speaker. And we know the member for Rankin was co-architect with the member for McMahon in $387 billion of high taxes. Only the coalition could be trusted to create a stronger economy and more jobs.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question to the Treasurer refers to his earlier answer. Why won't the Treasurer admit that since he took over, economic growth has almost halved, wages growth has stalled, consumption growth has weakened, business investment and productivity have declined, underemployment has increased, government debt and household debt have reached new record highs, and that all of this happened before the fires and the coronavirus hit?
The Treasurer has the call. Members on my left.
Mr Speaker, where's the member for Rankin when you need a hug in this place, Mr Speaker? Where is the member for Rankin now? The member for Rankin mentioned unemployment, Mr Speaker. The reality is...
Member for Rankin, member for Griffith.
These are the facts, Mr Speaker. When Labor was last in office, unemployment was 5.7%, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. The Treasurer will resume his seat. Just before I call the Leader of the Opposition, members on my right. I'm going to say to the Leader of the Opposition, the Treasurer is 21 seconds into his answer, and I'm happy to hear a point of order, but I remind him I'm happy to hear a point of order, but I just remind him only one point of order can be taken on relevance. So it is quite extraordinary that he's only 21 seconds in. Treasurer has the call. That's all right. You wrote the standing order. I thought you might have remembered it.
Mr Speaker,
the Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, if I was each way, I'd be watching my back right there, Mr Speaker. I'd be watching my back because the member for Rankin, he's gathering the kitchen utensils, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, the question referred to employment growth and unemployment, Mr Speaker. Now, unemployment was 5.7% when Labor was in office. Today it is 5.3%, Mr Speaker. When Labor was in office, employment growth was just 0.7%. Today it is 1.9%, Mr Speaker. Investment was referred to by the member for Rankin. Under Labor, non-mining investment was in free fall, falling 10% over their 6 years in government to with growth of over 30% since we came to government, Mr Speaker. Under Labor, 62,000 small businesses shut their door in their last year, whereas 62,000—
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The member for Hindmarsh. On the point of order.
Well into the second minute on relevance. The question was clearly restricted to the time during which the member has been the Treasurer of this country, not any previous period.
I just say to the Treasurer that is a reasonable point. He's entitled to compare and contrast, which he's done. But there was another problem with the question that I'm happy to point out now, which, when it begins with a "why won't you admit," it does kind of leave things wide open. But the Treasurer needs to come back to the question.
Mr. Speaker, I can inform the House that in January of this year, when I'm still the Treasurer, Mr. Speaker, that the IMF has said that Australia's economic growth will be higher than the United States, higher than the United Kingdom, higher than France, higher than Germany, higher than Japan, higher than Canada in 2020 and 2021. Mr. Speaker, the facts tell the story that the Australian economy has grown on the Coalition's watch. Mr. Speaker, more small businesses have been created, more people have found jobs, and importantly, we have delivered lower taxes, Mr. Speaker. More than $300 billion of lower taxes have passed through the Parliament. Mr. Speaker, only the Coalition can be trusted to deliver a stronger economy and more jobs.
Just before I call the member for Mayo, I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Pacific Friendship Group of the German Bundestag. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you all. And we also have present the former member for Paterson, the Honourable Bob Baldwin. Welcome back. And I call the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. By November 2019, NBN had assigned satellite NBN to 2,379 premises within 25 kilometres of the Adelaide GPO. Sydney has just 139 within the same distance. Now NBN has been assigned to 495 residents satellite NBN to my community of Marles, just 20 kilometres from the CBD as the crow flies. Why has the government assigned technology that was designed for remote Australia to nearly 3,000 properties, and will you review the decision with respect to Marles that has angered my community so?
The Minister for Communications has the call.
I do thank the member for Mayo for her question. And of course, the Morrison government is rolling out the national broadband network around Australia. There are 10.7 million premises able to connect. Some 6.6 million premises are connected, which is a very interesting contrast to the number that were able to connect when we came to government in 2013. Barely 51,000 premises able to connect to the NBN in 2013. Now 6.6 million premises connected around the country. Now, of course, an essential feature of the design of the NBN that we inherited from the Labor Party is a mix of technologies, fixed wireless and satellite. And that mix of technologies is deployed according to the needs of the communities that it serves. Everybody gets at least 25 megabits per second peak speed, and of course the NBN rollout will be completed this year. Now, the member asks me about what is proposed in relation to the areas around the Marles township. That's beyond the fixed line footprint in the township, but the areas which surround the township. Now, it's important to be clear that specific network design decisions are ones for NBN Co. Board and management are required to meet the statement of expectations which has been set for them by the government, but they make the specific decisions. And the majority of premises around the Marles township are expected to be connected via the Sky Muster satellite service. There will be some who will be connected to fixed wireless through towers at locations such as Yuchunga North, Littlehampton, Scott Creek and Cherry Gardens. And the assessment will be done on a case-by-case basis to determine which premises can be served from those fixed wireless towers, but the majority of premises are expected to be served through the Sky Muster satellite service. So that footprint will be determined relatively soon. NBN Co is committed to keep you informed, you and your office, and I'm advised by NBN that your constituents will be able to place an order for either fixed wireless or for satellite well before the 30th of June this year. And I make the point, Mr Speaker, that thanks to the work we've done to correct the mess that we were inherited, the NBN will be completed 4 years more quickly and for $30 billion less of taxpayers' money than the ramshackle mess we inherited from this hopeless, incompetent lot on the other side.
The member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is building resilience in regional communities, particularly those affected by fires, flood and drought? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, in the Great Lakes and Manning and Hastings Valleys areas, they suffered dreadfully from the fires in November in the member for Lyne's electorate, and he was there alongside them, supporting them, Mr Speaker, putting his arms around them, making sure whatever federal assistance that he could offer, that we could offer as a government, that it was provided. And I thank him on behalf of the parliament for the dutiful work that he did, like so many members right across the parliament, to help our fire-stricken residents, Mr Speaker. Last Sunday in Sydney, I am being bipartisan opposition leader. I'm being very bipartisan about this. There was a memorial service held, and a very moving bipartisan and moving memorial service held in Sydney, in Homebush, for the 25 victims, one of whom, of course, was a Johns River resident. Of course, hundreds of homes and outbuildings were either damaged or indeed destroyed in the Lyne electorate. As I say, a resident was sadly, tragically taken, along with 24 other residents in New South Wales alone. They were remembered, they were mourned, and the nation mourns with New South Wales, and we will build back better. The member for Lyne knows that. That's why we've established an initial outlay of $2 billion has gone for the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, headed by former Australian Federal Police Commissioner Andrew Colvin, doing a very, very good job, making sure that he's out in the communities, whether it's Kangaroo Island, whether it's Yeppoon, the north coast of New South Wales, Batlow, Tumbarumba, the East Gippsland area, Malakuta. He's out there. He's making sure that people know that we will build back better. There for the here and now, there for the weeks and months, indeed years ahead, to help rebuild those communities, rebuild and restore those towns and villages. Regional Australia is a very resilient area, Mr Speaker. I was at Geraldton late last week talking to the tourism operators, talking to the crayfishers, the lobster fishers about the coronavirus and the effects it's having on their industry, given the fact that with the Chinese Lunar Year they've lost their markets, they've lost their exports to be able to reap the rewards of their harvest, and unfortunately that opportunity for them this season is lost. Dave Towers, a 40-year veteran, said he was thankful for what the government's doing as far as the $76 million tourism outlay for both domestic and international tourists, but realises that for them the coronavirus is taking its toll. And regional Australia is heavily impacted by fires, by floods, by the coronavirus. I'm asked about alternatives. Well, the alternative is the zero net emissions target that Labor wants to take us down, and that will particularly affect regional Australia, Mr Speaker. It will hurt farmers, it will hurt the transport sector, it will hurt those people who call regional Australia home.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister critical of the New South Wales government for committing to net zero emissions by 2050?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We're working with the New South Wales government. And just a few weeks ago, the Premier and I stood together and we agreed a plan, some $2 billion, to invest in what is happening in New South Wales and in Australia to achieve important targets, Mr Speaker, and we have a plan. See, that's the thing, Mr Speaker. That's what the Leader of the Opposition doesn't understand. He doesn't have a plan. He just has some sort of vague commitment to something 30 years from now. See, I'm happy to work with the New South Wales government because they have a plan and we have a plan, and together we're implementing that plan. And I'll tell you what a big part of that plan is. It's about getting access to the gas that this country needs to ensure that we can firm up renewable investments in this country, which is at record levels, to put stability into our electricity grid. That's a plan, Mr Speaker. The problem with what the Labor Party is proposing with their net 2050 commitment, net zero target of 2050, is they have no plan. Where's the $22 billion going to come from every year for the next 30 years? Where's the more $1 trillion investment that is supposed to be in place to achieve what they say can be achieved? And Labor has no plan to deliver this. And I know why they don't have a plan, Mr Speaker, because all this is about is trying to avoid the hard question about what is Labor's commitment to 2030. Those opposite cannot agree amongst themselves.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Hindmarsh on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A minute and a half in, it was a very tight question about whether or not the Prime Minister was critical of the New South Wales government.
I'm not sure what the point of order is.
On direct relevance. He's had
a
wide range. It was a very specific question.
The member for Hindmarsh can resume his seat. At the very start of, you're right, the question was asking whether he was critical, and I think the Prime Minister answered it by saying he was working with the New South Wales government. I mean, you can't demand a yes or no answer. I was about to say to the Prime Minister, though, whilst he can compare and contrast over the 2050, he wasn't asked about alternatives, and whilst he's canvassed that by way of compare and contrast, he'll need to bring himself back to the question. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And a key part of what we're working with the New South Wales government on is how we meet our 2030 commitment to ensure we reduce emissions by 26%. And a key part of that is how we've been able to agree with the New South Wales government to get access to the gas, get the gas out from under our feet to ensure that we can firm up the renewable investments that put stability into the electricity grid. Now, that's what we're doing because we have a plan to meet our commitments. When we make a commitment, we have a plan to meet those commitments. We took that plan to the last election, Mr Speaker, and it was endorsed. The Labor Party took a commitment to a 45% emissions reduction target. They had no clue how they were going to achieve it. They didn't have any clue about what would it cost, and they were rejected by the Australian people. This Labor leader is doing exactly the same thing, Mr Speaker. He is the same bill you couldn't afford last time, and you can't afford him now.
The Prime Minister has concluded his answer, and I call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is delivering on its commitment to reduce our emissions while supporting greater reliability in electricity generation? Is the Minister aware of any threats associated with any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and acknowledge her very strong focus on affordable, reliable energy, whilst also delivering emission reductions. And of course, we are doing exactly that. In fact, in the latest data update, we can see that Australia's domestic emissions are down 2.3%, Mr Speaker, 2.3% year on year. And more than that, Mr Speaker, in the national electricity market, we've seen in the last year emissions down 3.2%. Now, central to that has been world-leading levels of investment in solar and wind. Indeed, 6,300 megawatts in the last year, $9 billion worth of investment, and we expect the same level of investment, or a very similar level of investment, this calendar year, Mr Speaker. But that creates a challenge because we have to have a solution for when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And that's why we're taking practical action to make sure that there is reliable energy in the system, Mr Speaker. Now, central to that is an investment of almost $1.4 billion in Snowy 2.0, 175 hours worth of storage, Mr Speaker, a huge battery in Tantangara Dam in the Snowy Mountains, Mr Speaker. We're supporting transmission upgrades through the $1 billion Grid Reliability Fund, Mr Speaker, and we're focused on 24/7 supply coming into the market, Mr Speaker. 2 new gas generators being underwritten under our underwriting new generation program, Mr Speaker. And gas is absolutely central to ensuring we have enough storage and backup in the system. The Prime Minister has just talked about the New South Wales deal, 70 petajoules of new gas for the domestic market coming into a market of 120. That will move the dial on making sure we have affordable, reliable gas and affordable, reliable electricity. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about alternatives. I'm asked about alternatives. And the alternative is to have a target without a plan. Now, Mr Speaker, the South Australians in particular have seen how this works, because we saw in South Australia a Labor government, a previous Labor government, that had a net zero target without a plan.
The member for Fremantle will leave understanding order 94A.
In 2016, Mr Speaker, South Australia saw widespread blackouts, which the South Australian Chamber of Commerce said cost businesses $367 million, $5,000 per business, Mr Speaker. And now the Leader of the Opposition wants to do it all over again, Mr Speaker. They haven't learnt from their policy mistake, Mr Speaker. They are all target and no plan.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has now had more than one full sitting day to correct his mislead of the Parliament that only eligible projects were funded under his sports rort scheme. Why has he failed to correct the record when the Auditor-General has given evidence to the Senate that his claim is just not true, that in fact 43% is the correct figure?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his questions, and the comments that I made on that matter were made on the basis of the information that was available to me from the ANAO report.
Members on my left.
Mr Speaker, that ANAO report, at the time of my making that comment, Mr Speaker, made only one reference to ineligible projects, as best as I'm aware. On page 9, it said, and I quote, "No applications assessed as ineligible were awarded grant funding," and that point was reiterated by the NAO during the committee hearing. In fact, the ANAO's Brian Boyd reiterated this
Member for Kingston.
when speaking to the committee on the Thursday, or the 13th of February, and said, in response to a question from Senator Canavan, was there a project that received funding that was assessed as ineligible by Sports Australia? Mr Speaker, the answer to that was no. That's what the ANAO responded to in relation to that matter. And I would refer the ANAO report to the Leader of the Opposition, and he will not find in that report anything to contradict the statement that I made at that time, Mr Speaker, relying on that report. But I can tell you about, Mr Speaker, another report, in that in a program administered by the member for Grainler— you don't like this, do you?
Member for Hindmarsh, on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, we're halfway through this question. The question was specifically about one report and whether or not the Prime Minister will correct the record.
Is the Leader of the House seeking the call? The Leader of the House.
Well, the question couldn't have been answered more explicitly and directly, and there is always an ability to compare and contrast when we're talking about reports of this type.
As I've said numerous times, and this is a member for Isaacs. That's all right. Just have the mute button on for a while. The point I've made is I have allowed an ability for a brief compare and contrast. So the member for Hindmarsh knows that. That's certainly been the practice of previous speakers as well. And if you examined Hansard's all the way back, you'd see that. But I also say to the Prime Minister, it's brief. It's not an opportunity to then move on to previous audit reports for the rest of the answer. The Prime Minister has the
I'll be happy to be brief, Mr Speaker, in quoting from page 38 of the ANA Audit Report No. 3 of 2010-11 relating to the program administered by the member for Grainler. It says, in one instance, ministers—
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It goes to the Prime Minister's misleading of the Parliament.
What's the point of order?
My point of order is paragraphs 4.32 and 4.33
No, the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. No. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Minister will cease interjecting. And I just say to the Leader of the Opposition, he has other forms of the House to pursue what he's referring to. The member for Lyons can leave the chamber under 94A. Might be better for the member for Lyons to sort of leave the tactics to others. I'm trying to address the House. I'm just making the point that the Leader of the Opposition has other forms of the House to pursue that, which he could do almost immediately or later on. But one of those forms of the House isn't the ability to raise a point of order and debate the matter. He's asked the question. I've made my ruling on the brief comparison. I think if the Prime Minister's almost finished, the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker. In one instance it says ministers made an explicit decision to approve an application that was known to be otherwise ineligible under the guidelines. That's what the member for Grainler did, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, that's what he did, Mr Speaker. And the hypocrisy of him to come into this place when his hands themselves are blackened by his own failures in this area is disgraceful.
Member for McEwen, the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Given the significant challenges facing our agriculture sector as a result of the drought and recent bushfires, how is the Morrison-McCormack government backing our agriculture industry?
Member for Mallee, resume her seat. Just say to the members for McEwen and Bruce, of course, and others who are up there, they might be sort of having a few jokes amongst themselves, but I can't hear the question, so I'd like to hear it again. I tell you what, if you keep impeding me hearing the question, I can solve it pretty quickly. Okay? I just want to hear the question. Okay? If that's okay, by the second Deputy Speaker. The member for Mallee.
Given the significant challenges facing our agriculture sector as a result of the drought and recent bushfires, how is the Morrison-McCormack government backing our agricultural industry during these difficult times?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Mallee for her question, who has seen first-hand the devastation of this drought in her electorate in Western Victoria, but also is still at risk of bushfires. We have to understand the bushfire season is still alive in Victoria, and we need to make sure that we prepare for those fires. But we also need to be agile enough to help in the recovery in the here and now, and that's why the federal government, because of our economic stewardship, has been able to commit more than $10 million to both the fire and drought recovery. And in some places where the drought and fire intersects, we're doing both. $8 billion for the drought under our national drought strategy, under our three pillars. The first pillar under the here and now, supporting the farmers, putting money in their pockets to give them the support. Second pillar, and supporting the communities that support the farmers, because the drought extends past the farm gate into the communities that support them. And thirdly, for the first time, we're looking to the future. We're looking to build the dams, to build the infrastructure. We're saying the states who have the responsibility to dig the holes, here's the money, here's $3.2 billion, come and get it. But we've also said, here's the Future Drought Fund. For the first time, a fund that invests in the resilience, building the resilience of agriculture in future droughts, a $5 billion fund, giving a $100 million dividend every year. And with the fires, we've committed over $150 million in direct support immediately to help those that have been impacted by the fires, and a $2 billion initial investment in rebuilding the lives and the communities that have been impacted by these fires. Because you have to understand, these are now fragile regional economies, ones that need sound policy settings around them, and one that needs government not to put shockwaves through them with reckless policies not conceived, not costed. And that's what the alternative government said last weekend when they said they committed to a zero emissions target by 2050. It sent shockwaves through And you have to ask, why would they do that with no costings, not understanding the plan of what impact that would be, but their 2030 target, only 10 years down the track. The member for Hindmarsh has said we're going to have to take advice about what proper,
just ask the minister to resume his seat for a second. No, your microphone's off for a sec. We're just going to say to the minister, referring to what I've said about the ability to briefly compare and contrast. I'm glad I listened to the question. No, I can see the Prime Minister. I can tell the Prime Minister and others what was actually asked did not include alternatives. And I listened very closely to the question. I have a transcript of it here. Let me be blunt. I'm not sure what was planned, but I know what was asked. And the minister was not asked for alternatives, so he needs to confine himself to the question, which was, given the significant changes facing the agriculture sector as a result of drought and bushfires, how's the government backing industry during difficult times? And it ended with the words difficult times.
Being someone from regional Australia, I do fear for the alternatives there, but I will stick to our plan because of the economic stewardship that we have put in place, understanding how these regional economies work, knowing how intricate they are. Every part of them are intertwined in making sure that every part of that economy is stimulated. That takes responsible stewardship, that takes understanding. That's what this government has because of the strong economic foundations that we put around our economy.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again addressed to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer where he again misled the parliament when he said there was nothing in the Audit Office report that contradicted his previous statement to the parliament. I refer him to sections 4.32 and 4.33 of the report, which says, in addition to program ineligibility, this situation suggests, particularly in respect of the 8 completed projects, those selected for funding under the program may not have required Australian government funding in order to deliver their projects, and speaks about the two.
I don't think there was a question there within the 30 seconds. Members on my right. So we'll move to the member for Bowen.
Thank you, Speaker. A question to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on what actions the Morrison government is taking to keep Australians safe and to protect Australians from the outbreak of coronavirus?
The Minister for Health.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Bowman, who throughout his career has been a great advocate and practitioner of public health. Shortly before coming to question time, I was informed by the National Incident Centre that for the first time
the Minister for Health has the call.
Shortly before question time, I was informed by the National Incident Centre that for the first time the number of diagnosed cases with coronavirus has exceeded 80,000. That number is sadly backed up by almost 2,700 people who have now lost their lives to coronavirus. The situation globally has seen significant jumps in Japan and South Korea, in Iran and also in parts of northern Italy. So all of these things come together to create a very real and significant global challenge declared by the World Health Organization as a global emergency. Against that background, as the Prime Minister has said, while we are not immune as a country, we are as well prepared as anybody could possibly be. And I say that because on the 21st of January, the Extraordinary Chief Medical Officer, Professor Brendan Murphy, made the decision to declare coronavirus very early on a disease of pandemic potential. That has triggered a series of actions in Australia. The standing up of the National Incident Centre, the standing up of the National Medical Stockpile, similarly the readiness and activation of the National Trauma Centre, the daily meetings of the Australian Health Protection Principles Committee, 3 meetings now of all state, territory and Commonwealth health ministers through teleconference, including on the weekend to discuss pandemic readiness. And I have to commend all of the states and territories, for their work, their readiness, their hospitals, their fever clinics, everything which has been prepared if the worst were to pass. At the same time, our hospitals have done an extraordinary job. There are 15 cases which have been identified in the general population in Australia. I can now inform the House, as the Prime Minister did shortly before question time, that all 15 of those cases have now been cleared and discharged from hospital. That is a very positive step and a reflection positively on the whole of the Australian health and medical services system. So there are great challenges afoot in this world. But I say to the Australian people that we are prepared, we are ready, and we will get through this. We will get through this because as a country we are united, as a system we are prepared, and as a parliament we are ready.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his misleading of Parliament in a previous answer. Isn't it a fact that the evidence given by the Australian National Audit Office to the Senate committee referred to section 4.32 and 4.33 of the Audit Office report that indicate that 272 ineligible projects were funded?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I note the member has asked me a question in relation to my earlier answer. And in my earlier answer, I made reference to the audit report findings in relation to the program administered by the member for Grayndler, Mr Speaker. So let me speak a little to those matters as he's introduced that into his question, Mr Speaker. That project, it said in the report, eligibility and compliance checking process was developed by the department but was abandoned partway through. Its implementation was not replaced with an alternative. Projects located in electorates held by the Australian...
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. This is about the misleading of the Parliament.
Members on my right.
The question was clearly about
the point of order is on
relevance, the misleading of the Parliament with regard to the ANAO Office report, sections 4.32, 4.33.
I get his gist. The member for Wright is not helping. I'm just going to make 2 points, because I listened. This is why I don't like people interjecting, as you saw with the previous question from the member for Mallee, because it's my job to listen very closely. Now, the Leader of the Opposition making statements about misleading. That's a very sort of abject term, and of course if he wanted to pursue that, he'd need to pursue that by way of a motion of deliberately misleading, which he well knows. So even asking a question about a minister or a Prime Minister misleading does open things up. I mean, that is sort of quite a claim that I think opens things up for a minister or a Prime Minister to be able to defend themselves. That's the first point. Defend themselves, and there's lots of precedent with that. The other thing I listened to very closely, because I have allowed, and it is reference to a previous answer, as I've made in previous rulings, that doesn't. It does open the door, but it doesn't open it to an extent, as the member for Isaacs discovered, that you can just, by merely stating that, go to any matter you wish to. But I listened very carefully to the Prime Minister, who said he would refer to that on that basis a little. So I've listening to him, and the Prime Minister's able to do that briefly by way of comparison, but not for the entire answer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I was referring specifically to the report I cited in my earlier answer. And in that report it says, Mr Speaker, in one instance ministers explicitly decide to waive the project eligibility criteria for an application they wish to fund. The awarding of funding to projects also disproportionately favoured ALP-held seats, Mr Speaker. It went on to say the Minister's office did not make any records outlining the extent to which each application had been assessed or how the application was ranked in respect to other competing applications. Mr Speaker, what I am aware of is that the Leader of the Opposition threw the rulebook away when he ran programs for infrastructure and grants when he was the Minister. How dare he come here and throw mud when he's covered in it himself?
The member for Isaacs is warned. And the reason I said briefly, before I call the next question, and you can stand there if you want, that's okay, is the reference to previous answers, as I said, and I probably didn't express it clearly enough, enables ministers and prime ministers to be questioned on matters in previous answers. And so the nature of the question did curtail it a little more than is normally the case. The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is keeping Australians safe by delivering on its commitment to protect Australians from terrorism and unprecedented levels of foreign espionage? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to say thank you very much to the member for Ryan for his support of our national security agencies, and the government obviously was very proud of the speech last night, frankly, that Mike Burgess made. I'm very proud of the work that ASIO does on a daily basis to keep Australians safe. I'm very proud of the work that the Australian Federal Police and the other agencies of the Home Affairs portfolio do day and night to make sure that they can defeat the scourge of terrorism and foreign interference as it is conducted in our country. Mr Speaker, as the Director-General of ASIO last night pointed out, we are facing an unprecedented level of threat, both in terms of those terrorist cells and people that would conduct themselves in the dark art of foreign interference. We know that young people now are influenced online, that young minds are indoctrinated in a matter of days or weeks, and that we have had a record number of people who have gone to fight in the Middle East. Those people have come back to Australia, and we have seen, Mr Speaker, a high level of activity here since that time. So we want to make sure, Mr Speaker, that ASIO is well resourced, and we've provided them with record resourcing. We want to make sure that they have the requisite ability through legislation to deal with those people that would seek to conduct a terrorist attack on our shores, and also those foreign state actors that would seek to interfere with our democratic processes or on our university campuses or in businesses, etc. So it was a very stark reminder, and I think all Australians now have heard the message that Australia is not immune from a terrorist attack like any Western democracy, whether it's the United Kingdom, the United States, France, anywhere in the world where we've seen these people act out. There is the capacity for these people, whether they're on the right wing, whether they're on the left wing, anywhere in between. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, Mr Speaker. The fact is that we will deal with that threat, and we will make sure that well, it's funny that the Labor Party should interject because they cut money from ASIO, and if you think we're going to take a lecture from those people who on 19 occasions, when we've introduced legislation to support ASIO and the Federal Police, they've opposed it, Mr Speaker, or they've sought to water it down, and when they were in government they cut money from ASIO. So don't take a lecture from the Labor Party. They want the public to believe that there is no difference between the Labor Party and the coalition when it comes to border protection or national security. They are weak on both. And we know that the previous Leader of the Opposition was particularly weak when it came to border protection. But this guy, with his glass jaw, takes the cake. Watch him in question time. He has a glass jaw and he demonstrates it every day.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Can the minister explain why she counts nights in the Novotel Barossa Valley Resort as Australian industry content for the future submarines?
I'll call the minister. The minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. thank the member for his question. Mr Speaker, our $50 billion investment in the Future Submarine program has economy-wide benefits that extend beyond the defence industry, and I think that goes to the answer for the question to the member opposite. And this does include those businesses and organisations that were mentioned by the member opposite. Mr Speaker, some of those businesses will contribute to the capability of this program, that is for sure, if you looked at the list.
Members on my left.
We will also receive investment in a whole raft of different organisations. This investment across the Australian economy will support Aussie jobs in the decade ahead, that is for sure. Mr Speaker, this is a generational job-creating program, and any investment in Australian companies is good investment in my eyes. That's what a long-term investment will deliver us, Mr Speaker. Guaranteed Aussie jobs and opportunities for small businesses. Mr Speaker, you might have heard last night the Minister for Defence and also the Naval Group announced a commitment of at least 60% AIC in the Future Submarine program. That is what we should be celebrating today. That is what we should be doing.
Member for Sydney.
Mr Speaker, we will achieve beyond that 60% AIC. As the Vice President of Naval Group said last night, this government is a demanding customer, and I wear that as a badge of honour. We are a demanding customer, because when we are a demanding customer, we are backing small defence industry, medium defence industry in this country. We will maximise the Australian industry involvement, Mr Speaker, because that is the contractual objective. We are backing Australian businesses every day and every night.
Member for Sydney's been warned. And the member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. And will the minister outline for the House how the Morrison government is keeping Australians safe by delivering on its commitment to back Australian defence industry? And is the minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Stirling for his question. How we ever follow that, I'm not quite sure, but I really would like to acknowledge his performance within the Australian Defence Force and also his strong passion for the defence industry, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, because of a strong economy and the Morrison government's strong budget management, we are keeping Australians safe by delivering on our commitment to the defence industry and also delivering for our defence forces. Mr Speaker, last week the Prime Minister and I had the great pleasure of visiting the RAF base Tyndall in the Northern Territory, where we announced our government will invest some $1.1 billion in the base, which is on top of the $495 million that we've already invested in the new air combat capability infrastructure at the base. Mr Speaker, as part of that investment, $242 million in work flowed into the Northern Territory community, with 38 local companies sharing in some 64% of the work. This is good news for the Territory, Mr Speaker. That's Territorian businesses being able to test their capability, Territorian businesses being able to grow their capability, and over 300 Aussie jobs will be created in the next phase of the project. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister and I had the great pleasure, and we saw firsthand the quality of work being undertaken at the base by local Katherine contractors, like Mr Jeff Usher from Custom Cabinets, who supplied the bench tops, the cabinets and custom joinery during the upgrade. And I'd also like to acknowledge and commend Savannah Solutions, who provided services including developing opportunities for Indigenous businesses to be a part of this program. And I think it's worth mentioning, Mr Speaker, that some $27 million was invested in local Indigenous businesses for this $495 million investment. For the next $1.1 billion phase, the managing contractor expects that the local content will actually exceed 70%. So this is great news for Territorian businesses, great news for those Territorian construction industry and defence industry, but more importantly, great news for developing new jobs in the Northern Territory.
Mr Speaker, when you compare that to the record of those opposites, I think it's pretty clear that we on this side are backing defence industry. In Labor's 6 years of office, defence spending was cut by $18 billion, bringing the defence budget to its lowest level since World War II. Mr Speaker, our government has spent the last 6 years reversing that neglect to our Australian defence industry. We're investing a record $200 billion in our defence capability, which will create more jobs and create more opportunities for our Australian defence industry.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Minister for Defence Industry. Can the minister explain why she counts the work of French language school Adelaide's Alliance Française as Australian industry content for the future submarines?
The Minister for Defence Industry. So on my left, the Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. As I said in a previous answer, Mr Speaker, our $50 investment in the future submarine program has wide economic benefits. And this includes a variety of businesses and organisations that was mentioned by the member opposite. Mr Speaker, some of those businesses we know will contribute to the capability of this program, but all will receive investment under this program.
Member for Chifley.
What we do know is that this supports a raft of small, medium-sized businesses supporting jobs. Mr Speaker, what we're focused on this side of the House is we're backing the growth of Australian jobs. We're going to deliver on that $200 billion that we've committed to determine our defence capability. That includes developing and creating 57 new vessels built in Australia by Australians using Australian steel. We are committed to the submarine program on time, on budget and on spec.
The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney outline to the House how the Morrison government is delivering on its commitment to keep Australians safe, including through critical national security legislation, and is he aware of any alternative approaches?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and his abiding interest in this important part of government's agenda. And since coming to government in 2013, this government has passed 19 separate tranches of national security legislation. They've covered a very broad range of issues, and they're meant to deal with a very broad range of threats, from removing abhorrent, violent terrorist material to disrupting espionage and foreign interference. And in this answer, I'd like to concentrate and focus on one very important area, which was the counter-encryption laws that we introduced. Those laws, as introduced and passed by this government, give federal and state agencies the ability to use powers for counter-encryption against a broad range of offences, not just terrorism, but drug trafficking, murder, slavery, espionage. And the very, very important speech that was given by the new Director-General of ASIO last night showed why those laws are important, why it's important they don't get watered down, and why it's important that they come through this parliament in a reasonable time and in a timely way. The Security Director-General for ASIO, Mike Burgess, last night said our counter-encryption laws were used within 10 days of them coming into effect, in his words, by ASIO to prevent a real risk of injury to Australians. That is what our government's agenda, legislative agenda, achieves on the ground. And this is a very timely point to recall what the Shadow Attorney-General's position on precisely these counter-encryption laws were. On 3 December 2019, the Shadow Attorney-General's position was very clear, being interviewed by Fran Kelly, who asked, the amended version that Labor is putting forward only applies to terrorists and perhaps pedophiles and would only empower the national security agencies to intercept encrypted messages, not the state police forces. Is that correct? And the response was, that's our proposal. So the Shadow AG's position on 3 December 2019 was that the counter-encryption bill should not extend its counter-encryption provisions beyond terrorism. That is to say, they should not apply to murder, to espionage, to matters of this type. And their position at that point in time was also that the bill should not extend to state police forces. That was their position on 3 December. Kicking and screaming, they were dragged to help pass the bill on 8 December, and by 18 December the laws were used to protect Australians. Their position was to delay, obstruct and oppose the bill in the form that it was finally passed by this parliament. And the Victorian Assistant Commissioner said their position would significantly impact the fight against many types of crimes. And it was interesting they mentioned right-wing terrorism because this goes straight to the heart of that issue.
The member for Paterson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the community of Williamtown and surrounds in my electorate has been deeply affected by PFAS contamination. When will the Prime Minister release the government's response to the report into PFAS contamination, which was tabled in this parliament in December 2018?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question on this very important matter. As you would be aware, the issues surrounding PFAS have been going back over many government administrations. They go back over this government's administration,
Members
over
on my
the previous
left,
government's administration, and many more beyond that, Mr Speaker. This government decided to actually take action on this issue, and as the member would be aware, we are currently engaged in mediation with the parties.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister please update the House on how Australian scientists and researchers are contributing to the global effort to develop a vaccine for the coronavirus, and how is the Morrison government backing these efforts?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, and I acknowledge the very significant contribution that she has made to medical and scientific research, and I congratulate her for her efforts. Mr Speaker, the safety and security of all Australians is the Morrison government's #1 priority. And we understand that there is a very real concern in our community about the outbreak of coronavirus. Parents are talking with their children, there are discussions happening around the kitchen table, and we are all very concerned about the ways to best deal with protecting those who are most vulnerable in our community from this very serious illness. Now, this very serious illness has some significant implications for individuals, for our health services, for our border services and, of course, for trade and industry. And that's why it's so very important that we work as hard and as fast as we can to develop a vaccine to prevent the spread of this very serious illness. Now, people around the globe turn to Australian researchers for this because we are clearly world-leading. Of course, Australia's premier research organisation, CSIRO, is working to develop this vaccine as soon as it possibly can. Now, we've done this before. CSIRO developed the world's first effective flu treatment and a vaccine for the Hendra virus. We were at the forefront of the study into SARS. Now, many members would be aware that last week the University of Queensland announced their researchers had developed a promising potential vaccine for coronavirus. This vaccine is now at CSIRO's state-of-the-art production facility in Melbourne, and our researchers are currently testing it with a view to upscaling it to production if it's suitable. Now, at CSIRO's high-tech animal health laboratory in Geelong, researchers continue to grow the virus and work to better understand it. And that facility is in fact the most sophisticated high-containment laboratory in the world, which means that we can safely research the most lethal diseases. Now, Mr Speaker, because our government has taken a responsible and balanced approach to our budget and managing our budget, we're able to deliver a bigger investment in our science and research organisations. And what I can say to all Australians, Mr Speaker, is that they can be assured, all Australians can be assured, that their safety and their security is the #1 priority of the coalition government.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Is the Minister's so-called announcement of a 60% Australian industry content on the future submarine contained in any contract between the Australian Government and Naval Group?
The Minister has the call. The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member. I recall standing here over a week ago where I clearly outlined that in the contract we are in the design phase, and at the end of the design phase we would then be in a position to agree what the AIC contribution was going to be. The good news, and it's a great opportunity to talk about it, the good news is that now we have our own Minister for Defence has now met with her French counterpart, and now they have agreed that the AIC in the submarine contract will be no less than 60%. That is good news, Mr Speaker. But what my job and what our job is on this side of the House is to make sure that we maximise, because that is the contractual objective in the contract. We will work hard to ensure that it's beyond 60%. I repeat, once the design phase is finished, we will then progress to that. But this is incredibly good news, and I'm disappointed that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition does not see it for what it is.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting women diagnosed with ovarian cancer?
The Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and may I thank the member for Boothby for her question. Tomorrow is Teal Ribbon Day and this month is Ovarian Cancer Month, to acknowledge the thousands of women, their families and friends impacted by ovarian cancer this year. And can I acknowledge members of Parliament who attended Ovarian Cancer Australia's Teal Ribbon Breakfast this morning. Ovarian cancer is estimated to be the 10th most commonly diagnosed cancer in Australian women, with 1,532 cases projected this year, and it's the 6th most common cause of death from cancer in Australian women, with 1,068 deaths estimated this year. The 5-year relative survival rate for ovarian cancer is 45.7%. This compares with 68.9% for all cancers combined, and with 90.8% and 95.2% for breast and prostate cancer, respectively. We are committed to improving outcomes for women affected by ovarian cancer, and I want to acknowledge the commitment of the Minister for Health, and in particular the former Minister for Women, Kelly O'Dwyer, who continues to serve as an ambassador for the Ovarian Cancer Research Foundation, fighting, as she did in this place, for better health outcomes for women. We've come a long way in the last 20 years, notwithstanding we have a lot further to go. One of our first ovarian cancer advocates was Sheila Lee. After receiving her shocking diagnosis in February 1999, she was appalled at the lack of awareness of the disease, the lack of its profile compared with other cancers, and the lack of research. Sheila and her husband Simon started speaking out, raising awareness, determined to make ovarian cancer silent no more. She spoke of symptom awareness holding the key to hundreds of lives and research holding the key to thousands. In the just 20 months before we lost her after that tragic diagnosis, Sheila and her team set the organisation Ovarian Cancer Australia on the trajectory where we see it today. We have available now $20 million in funding for ovarian cancer research through the Medical Research Future Fund, and a further $15 million for clinical trial funding in reproductive cancers. Since 2013, over $40 million has been provided for ovarian cancer research through the National Health and Medical Research Council. We're continuing subsidising proven treatments on the PBS, adding 2 new MBS items for genetic testing for hereditary mutations predisposing to breast or ovarian cancer. And in 2019, the government committed funding for the ovarian cancer case management pilot. We're particularly focusing on reaching out to rural Australian women as we continue as a nation to battle this horrific disease.
And the member for McMahon on brief indulgence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. To associate the opposition with the comments of the minister, this morning the Prime Minister and members across the aisle gathered to mark the fact that 4 Australian women will be today diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and 4 tomorrow and 4 the day after. And the survival rate is too low, at 46%. And that was particularly stark this morning when we were reminded that the 2 speakers at last year's breakfast, Jill Emberson and Kristen Larson, are no longer with us here today to speak at this year's breakfast. And this morning we met with not only survivors of ovarian cancer, but women fighting it as we speak, who are sharing their courage with this parliament to remind us that we have much, much more to do. It is the 8th most common cancer, but a very big killer of women. And this parliament and this country has a long way to go. We join with the government in the efforts undertaken.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.